Hello, and welcome back to Philosophy 1050, an introduction to philosophy. This is Lecture 4. Today we will be covering The Apology by Plato. Now, The Apology takes place during Socrates' trial and his defense of himself. Do note, though, that although it's called The Apology, that doesn't mean that Socrates is apologizing to anyone in the sense that we know it today. Instead, the sense of apology used here is closer to the sense used in the term Christian apologetics. It's more of a defense against criticisms rather than an apology in the modern sense. Now, Socrates stands in front of the court, officially charged with corrupting the youth, failing to acknowledge the gods of Athens, and creating different spiritual beings instead. These are very serious charges in that time, and so Socrates is in quite a lot of trouble here. So what does he do then? Well, firstly, he gives a little bit of a preamble to the people listening to him in the court. He sets himself as a humble person that isn't very clever. He tells the court that he's not a clever speaker, and he did not prepare in advance, and that he doesn't know how to speak in court. Nevertheless, Socrates says that he wants to show that his case is just, and he will do this by using the most simple language possible. He doesn't want to add anything flowery or use any big metaphors, he just wants to make his point. Socrates is, in this, perhaps being a little bit deceptive, as he is certainly clever, and given his defense, we can only presume that he prepared in advance. In any case, this serves the purpose of establishing Socrates as humble, which is a theme of many of Plato's dialogues. Now, after setting the stage a bit, Socrates moves on to distinguish between what he calls his first accusers and the people who are charging with him now. So, we have the first accusers. And they have a different set of accusations against Socrates than the ones that he's officially charged with in the trial right now. So he says that these first accusers have been around for a long time, criticizing him, but those criticisms aren't fair. Despite them not being fair, however, most of Athens has heard those criticisms, and Socrates has not had a chance to defend himself properly against them. Thus, Socrates sets out to first dismiss the old rumors that are probably influencing the jury despite the trial just beginning. So what are these old rumors, these old accusations? Well, first of all, he's accused of pondering what is in heaven and below earth. In other words, it's kind of like talking about things he shouldn't be talking about. Now, the next first accusation is making the weaker argument the stronger. And not only that, but teaching others to do the same. So we have two first accusations here that are basically just rumors that have been flying around for a long time. So Socrates first says that there's an assumption contained in these accusations, namely that someone who investigates things like what is in heaven and below earth must be not acknowledging the gods. Now, Socrates wants to basically dismiss this idea that such investigations imply he's an atheist. Now, it should be said that back in those times, things in heaven, those below earth, had a very different connotation than they do now. As we learned on the lecture to the pre-Socratics, suggesting that the sun was a ball of fire and the earth was made of earth, and the moon was made of earth, got people into very big trouble. And because those things were supposed to be gods, not balls of rock and fire. So next, to emphasize this point, Socrates brings up Aristophanes' comedy, in which he's a character. So Aristophanes was basically a playwright back in the Greek days who wrote different comedies and tragedies, and one of them featured Socrates. This comedy portrayed Socrates as having his head in the clouds and pursuing all sorts of ridiculous questions. Socrates, in turn, challenges the people in the court to name a single time that that he ever spoke about the silly things mentioned in Aristophanes' play. Thus, Socrates dismisses the criticisms of him based on what he investigates and moves on to the criticisms based on making the weaker argument the stronger and teaching others to do the same. So to begin with, he denies that he has ever accepted a fee for teaching, like others do. And so he has never actually taught anybody for anything. This is a subtle jab at a group known as the Sophists. Their name implies that they are wise, but this group of people actually focus more on sounding good than being right. We'll talk a little bit more about them in later lectures. They would charge fees for their instruction, but often their instruction wasn't actually based in anything very concrete. So Socrates claims that he does not have the knowledge required to make people good. So he wouldn't be so arrogant as to teach other people how to be good. Now, that way, Socrates basically dismisses these first two charges against him, that the strange studies made him an atheist, and that he teaches other people to believe false things, or in other words, to make the weaker arguments the stronger arguments. But Socrates says, rhetorically, what has earned my notorious reputation? Well, let's clear a little bit of space here. Socrates says that what earned him his notorious reputation goes back to an event that happened a little while ago. So, let's see here. Right. So Socrates says that what gets him his very notorious reputation is that he has a very particular human wisdom. And what is that particular human wisdom? Well, he doesn't want to look like he's boasting, so he's saying that the sort of wisdom that he claims for himself is not something that he actually is saying about himself. It's something that the gods actually said about it. And more specifically, the oracle at Delphi, not himself. So it would be helpful to first mention what this oracle at Delphi is. Oracle of sometimes at Delphi. So what is the Oracle of Delphi? To the Greeks, the oracle was a chosen person, typically a woman, who was able to communicate the will of the gods to people on earth through visions and riddles. The word of the oracle, thus, was just as good as the word of the gods. To question the oracle was thus to question the gods. To us today, we know a little bit more about the cave that the oracle at Delphi stayed in, and what was happening in there. So it turns out that the cave most likely had gases leaking into it, such as methane, and these could affect the mind of someone inhaling them for a long enough time. But let's leave that where it is, because we're getting a little bit sidetracked. So again, Socrates claims that his notoriety comes from this special sort of wisdom that he has. And the Oracle of Delphi, not him, is the one who called him that. Now notice that Socrates is cleverly shifting the question so that people don't pay attention to what happened before this incident at the Oracle of Delphi. He wants them to just focus on what happened after. Now, so with that said, let's look at the story itself. Chaerephon, who knows Socrates, went to the oracle and asked the oracle whether there is anyone who is wiser than Socrates. The oracle replied no. Socrates, hearing this from Chaerephon, is totally confused because he knows that he doesn't have any wisdom. He's like, really, me? I'm kind of dumb. And he certainly thinks that there's other people that have more wisdom than he does. So he sets out to prove the oracle wrong, because surely the oracle must be wrong. And this is what Socrates is actually doing in most of the dialogues, including Euthyphro, which we just covered in our last lecture. Generally speaking, Socrates goes out, finds an expert who's supposed to be wise, have more wisdom than him, and he questions that expert about basic ideas that he's supposed to be expert on. And ultimately, Socrates shows the experts to not be very wise at all. He does this with politicians, with poets, with sophists, and with craftsmen. Thus, Socrates concludes, I must be wise because I'm the only one who realizes that I'm not wise. In other words, more commonly phrased, my wisdom consists in knowing that I know nothing. Now, neither Socrates nor the people he questions know anything of value, but at least Socrates knows that he doesn't know anything of value, whereas these other people don't even know that much. So those that were taken to be the wisest were often the ones with the least real understanding. Socrates continues on to give a religious interpretation of this story about him and the oracle at Delphi. It may be that this is God's way of telling humanity that it's not very wise. Socrates' way of serving the gods, therefore, is seeking out and those that claim to be wise and proving them not to be wise, even if that results in extreme poverty for Socrates, which often did happen. In fact, yes, it did happen. He was very poor. So to conclude his defense against his first accusers, Socrates claims that the youth began imitating him on their own. They go around bothering people who are supposed to be wise in the city and showing that they're not actually that wise. And those supposedly wise people, instead of getting mad at themselves, go out and get mad at Socrates. And so this is kind of the rumors and whatnot that have been building up before the trial that Socrates wants to address. Socrates says that his accusers hate him and have no specific wrong teaching to accuse him of, and instead they trot out these accusations that are used against any intellectual troublemaker, studying things in heaven and the earth, and making the weaker argument into the stronger. These accusations, Socrates contends, are entirely frivolous. Socrates then moves on to address the accusations from Meletus. Now, before we go on, so Socrates' main accuser is Meletus, and he has some very specific charges. First of all, it's corrupting the youth. Next up, it's failing to acknowledge the gods of Athens. And lastly, creating new spiritual beings. There we go. That was a mouthful. So Socrates first defends himself against the charge of corrupting the youth. Now he seeks to do this by showing that Meletus, the one charging him, doesn't actually care about whether or not the youth are good, only about hurting Socrates. So how does Socrates establish that Meletus does not care? How does Socrates establish that? Well, Socrates does this by asking Meletus about what it means to teach the youth well. More specifically, Socrates asks, if I'm not a good teacher, then who is a good teacher? Meletus doesn't answer this question right away, which Socrates argues is already evidence that he doesn't care about what makes the youth good. So Socrates continues, who influences the youth for the better? Meletus gives a first answer, the law. Well, Socrates shuts this down because Socrates is not asking what influences the youth for the better. He's asking who. Who are the teachers? So that's off the table. Okay, well, Meletus goes on to name, or at least agree to say that the judges would be good teachers, the audience in the court would be good teachers, the council would be good teachers, and everyone in Athens, eventually, except for Socrates, would be good teachers. Meletus agrees to this. So Socrates argues that this shows that Meletus does not care about what a good teacher is. In most cases, like for horses, there are very few good teachers. There are very few good horse trainers. So it can't be the case that everyone in Athens bet Socrates is a good teacher, because teaching a person is much harder than teaching a horse. Furthermore, it shows that, again, Meletus does not care whether or not Socrates was actually a good or a bad teacher. Socrates then goes on to the second defense against corrupting the youth. And this, I think, is a pretty clever argument. So let's have it right here. So step one of the argument: nobody wants to be harmed by their companions. So that's step one. And it seems pretty straightforward. Nobody wants to be hurt by their friends. Okay, what about step two? Corrupting your companions risks them harming you. Therefore, nobody, three dots together in a triangle like this is the symbol for therefore. Therefore, nobody intentionally, nobody, pen is running out, intentionally corrupts their companions. So I think this is a pretty solid argument here. Basically what Socrates is establishing is that if he was corrupting the youth, or his companions in other words, then he'd be doing it unintentionally, because nobody would intentionally want to be hurt by their own friends, and if you corrupt your friends, then your friends will hurt you. So it seems like a pretty good argument. And if he was, in fact, corrupting the youth, and it wasn't unintentional, then the reaction shouldn't be to punish Socrates, but rather the reaction should be to scold him and to teach him better ways. That's what you do with someone who's ignorant. Not, you don't punish them. Punishment is only for those who intentionally do wrong things. Now Socrates moves on to his defense of not acknowledging the gods of Athens, and instead creating new ones. And he kind of packages these together. So let's get a little bit more space here again. So firstly, he wants to make sure that people aren't judging him for the opinions of others. In court, if the court thinks that Socrates is an atheist because he thinks the sun and the moon are made of fire and rock, then they must be careful, because those views, as we learned in our earlier lecture, are actually the views of a pre-Socratic philosopher named Anaxagoras. And at that time, Anaxagoras' books were being sold on the main square in bookstalls. So they should be careful to take issue with Anaxagoras instead of Socrates, if that's what they're upset about. Secondly, Socrates argues that Meletus is being self-contradictory. He's saying both that Socrates acknowledges the gods and doesn't acknowledge the gods. So how does he establish this? Well, here's another argument. Someone who recognizes some sort of, let's call it X, phenomena, recognizes the existence of X. So this seems like a pretty straightforward thing. If you recognize, for example, dog phenomena, then it's likely that you recognize the existence of dogs. Socrates, being accused of recognizing spiritual phenomena, must therefore recognize the existence of spirits. Now, if Socrates recognizes the existence of spirits, then he recognizes the existence of gods, because spirits are just gods and the children of gods, according to Greek mythology. So, with this, Socrates argues against the second and third charges by showing that they are inconsistent with each other. Either Meletus has to drop this one, or Meletus has to drop this one. He can't have both. So, after this, Socrates goes on to address a charge not mentioned officially, but is probably being thought of by people. Aren't you ashamed to live in a way that has now led to you being in risk of death? Well, no, says Socrates, because Socrates wants to live justly, not longly. Or in other words, he's here for a good time, not a long time. Again, he appeals to Greek culture by saying that the heroes in Greek mythology thought the same way. They weren't worried about whether or not they're going to die in battle. They were worried about living well and about doing the noble thing. Moreover, Socrates sees what he does as a mission from the Oracle of Delphi. So it's like a military duty to him. It's unthinkable for him to abandon it. To abandon it would actually be to not acknowledge the gods, according to Socrates. Besides, to fear death and pretend like you know what comes after death is to pretend you have a wisdom that you don't know, because nobody's been to the other side and come back to tell us what it's like. And certainly Socrates doesn't want to claim to know what it's like. So if the only way that they would let Socrates go is by Socrates stopping philosophy, Socrates would refuse, because, as mentioned, he sees it as his duty to God to carry out his program of inquiring whether people are wise and proving them not to be wise. And furthermore, Socrates thinks he's actually doing something good by inspiring the people of Athens towards a pursuit of wisdom and truth, towards paying attention to the condition of their own souls, as he puts it. So again, Socrates asserts that he would rather die than stop. If they do kill him, though, Socrates says, the city would lose something very important. Indeed, Socrates claims that he's a gift from the gods. In this, he makes a famous comparison between himself and something called a gadfly. Now, I'm no entomologist, so I don't know exactly what a gadfly looks like, but I'm imagining it's just a really big fly that can bother horses. So, Socrates is like the gadfly, and the city is like the horse. Socrates annoys the city to awaken it from its slumber, so that it can be more active, in the same way that a gadfly keeps a horse moving because it's always annoying it. The fact that Socrates does this at the cost of his own poverty is also evidence that there's something divine going on here. He wouldn't be, sacrificing his own well-being if it wasn't for a better and more divine cause. Socrates' identity as the gadfly also made him not engage in politics beforehand too much, because, according to him, had he engaged in politics a lot, he would have already been killed long ago. So it is worthy to mention, too, that he did serve on the council at one time, and his voting record there shows that he made enemies and ultimately being correct on an unpopular opinion. In fact, he didn't really go out of his way to teach people at all. They just came, listened, and engaged for free. Nor did he ever claim to offer knowledge or instruction to anyone. There isn't even anyone around willing to say that they got a bad instruction from him. In the courts, there's no one being like, yeah, that's Socrates, he's the one that screwed me up. There's nobody like that. And on top of that, there's actually a whole bunch of people in the court right now that support Socrates, that have talked to Socrates. And so Socrates says, well, that's evidence that perhaps I'm doing well, but maybe those people that are here to support me, those are the ones I've corrupted, that I've brainwashed. And so how do I reply to that? Well, what about their relatives? I didn't talk to them, and yet they're here to support me as well. So clearly, whatever influence I had on these people, it was for the better. In all, Socrates concludes his defense by making the point about how he did not bring his family into the court to get pity points. Back in that time, when people got in trouble, they would bring in their daughters and their sons and their mother and everyone who cares about them, and they'd all cry together in the courts and try and get pity points. Well, Socrates says that's not what he wanted to do. Instead, Socrates asked to be acquitted, not as a favor, but just because that is the right thing to do. Unfortunately, and perhaps predictably, the court returned a guilty verdict for Socrates. The difference in votes was a small amount, only 30, and Socrates even remarks that this is a surprisingly small margin. At this point in the Greek legal system, the way it works is that the guilty person gets an opportunity to suggest a punishment for themselves. The prosecution also suggests the punishment, and then the court decides which punishment to give to the accused. Of course, the prosecution wants to have the death penalty. Socrates, knowing that that's what the prosecution is going to offer, gives the court an impossible option. His punishment should be free meals in the nicest part of town, basically. And so, obviously, they're not going to choose that because that's more of a reward than a punishment. A fine, he says, wouldn't work because he's poor and so he can't afford any fines. Banishment, well, that wouldn't work because he presumably would also annoy the people wherever he gets banished to, and then he'd get kicked out of there and kicked out of there. So that's not an option. And even if he tried to sort of shoo the youth away so that he doesn't get kicked out of the city, then the youth would kick him out of the city for shooing them away. So, lastly, banning him from doing philosophy definitely wouldn't work because Socrates, as we mentioned, refuses to stop. He sees it as his duty. Here he makes he states a famous quote of his. It's, "The unexamined life is not worth living." And this has been argued over a lot since then, but generally speaking, it's one of the more influential sort of quotes about philosophy. It's that philosophy is not just something you can do, it's something that makes your life better. And Socrates certainly thought that way. In the end, Plato, who will be covering, who wrote this dialogue, and the dialogues we'll be covering, offered him and some other friends of Socrates offered to pay a 30 minas fine on Socrates' behalf. And that's what Socrates presumably ultimately suggested. Again, predictably though, the jury sentences Socrates to death. So they don't accept the fine and instead make Socrates die. After this, Socrates basically gets to give his concluding remarks. So there's no more arguing really happening. Everything's decided, he's guilty, and he's sentenced to death. But now he just gets to say his parting words. He says, I'm convicted because I will not lower myself by false pleading, by bringing my family in for pity points. With my death, more critics of yours will arise that I've been advising to hold back. You have no idea. I think my death will be a good thing, because my conscience always tells me when something is a bad thing, and on this matter, it's completely silent. Besides, death isn't so bad. I mean, there's a few options. Either death is like a night's sleep, or death is like a journey. If death is like a night's sleep, well, that seems pretty relaxing, and I look forward to it. If death is like a journey then, and not only that, but a journey to a real judge, then I look forward to that too, because I'm sure my case will be judged fairly there. Also, I look forward to talking to the dead heroes of history, who I'm sure are all very wise. In all, I believe that nothing can harm a good man. With that said, go criticize my sons. I am now going to go to die. Only the gods will know who is right. Now, I was paraphrasing, so that's more or less what he said, but that's kind of his final hurrah to the court. He's sure of himself. He's not sad, he's not begging or anything like that. He knows what he chose, and he's happy he chose it. Now, we see in this story a great strength of character in Socrates. He refuses to abandon his principles, even if those principles involve him recognizing the lack of wisdom where he sees them. Instead of lowering himself by ignoring the truth, Socrates presents himself fully knowing that there is a good chance this will end in his death. This sort of strength of character also appears in the next two dialogues we're going to be reading, where Socrates is in jail and afterwards ends awaiting his execution. We will only be covering the first one, however, because we don't have that much time, so we'll be covering the first dialogue that comes after his sentencing, which is called Crito. Now, this area of philosophy, Plato's Dialogues, has whole classes dedicated to it, where you read perhaps not all the dialogues, but most of them. And it's typically called something like ancient philosophy or history of philosophy. So if you're interested, you can sign up for those in the next, when we offer them, hopefully next term. So with that, that concludes my lecture on the Apology. I hope you've learned a little bit about who Socrates was and why he did what he did. Next time, as mentioned, we'll be covering Crito. So, see you there.